And thank you, all of you who are joining us today. We're very honored and privileged to be spending the next hour with you. And we are really excited to share some ideas with you today. So we're going to begin quickly with a little bit of an outline of our goals. And I'd like to start off by saying that the objective, even though this is a webinar and the format by nature of this being a webinar is fairly didactic, we really encourage you to engage with this work. We would like you to be a participant as opposed to just someone who's watching this webinar. So we're going to engage you in a framework for understanding why your offering matters, and we're using the term offering to indicate whatever it is that you are offering to your community, be it a curriculum, a course, a program, so whatever it is that you're offering. We encourage you to explore what makes your offering uniquely important, how it relates to change, how to evaluate that change, and lastly, we're going to touch a little bit on how to use program evaluation tools to create capacity and sustainability for your program. So I think that as program developers, we often engage in a process of thinking about what we're doing and what we're creating, but it often comes after we think about why it matters, but we don't necessarily go through a very detailed process of inquiry when we think about why what we're doing matters. And so we're going to talk a little bit about why your work matters. We'll just review a few of the most frequent questions that we receive in our work with you. We'll talk about 7 common challenges that seem to occur for, I would say, the overwhelming majority of people who are working on building offerings for their communities. And then we'll provide you with 3 steps for success. So these are 3 general guidelines or a general rubric for thinking about how to construct not only your program, but how to construct that program with the end in mind. Then we will review a case study. And as we review the case study, again, we invite you not only to listen to how this problem was approached with this particular client, but also sit and think about how this relates to your program and perhaps even take notes and go through the process of inquiry while we're giving you a sense of how we've approached it with others. And then very briefly we'll talk about where to go from here, and given sufficient time we'll open it up for questions. So first of all, we'd like to just have an open discussion with you. I guess we can't, but we'll discuss why does this matter. And the reason why the why is important is because, as I said earlier, we tend to focus on what we're doing more than why we're doing it. So when you think about when you're developing an offering, be it a curriculum, be it a program, usually the first thing that comes to mind is, what am I going to do? And we sometimes have this why embedded in our consciousness, but it's not something that we bring to the fore. And so why this matters, why what we are bringing to you and offering to you today matters, is because if we don't have a sense of what motivates us and begin with the end in mind, a lot of times we're trying to recreate that importance, that problem. We're trying to recreate the solution for the problem ad hoc. And I think this will become a little bit more apparent to you as we explain this model a little bit further. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, and she's going to elaborate on this a little further.
So hello, thank you, Grace. I'm very happy to be engaging with this community and talking about an area that's really dear to my heart, which is program evaluation, and really trying to embody this intentional approach that this community offers into how to do really effective and rigorous evaluation. So I'm going to talk a little bit around some of the most important questions and issues that seem to come up again and again, both when you're approaching how to do evaluation, so in the earlier stages, and then some questions that occur, you know, as you're doing it and what happens after. So when you're doing an intentional evaluation for your offering, your program, your curricula, one of the questions that comes up is, how do you communicate this? And sort of going back to the question about why is this important, doing effective evaluation is critical for a coherent communication strategy. one that includes some forms of data, some forms of process, and then some forms of understanding who your stakeholders are. So we listed a few in this first bullet point. Different stakeholders that can be critical to wanting to understand what you have done, why, and how it has been effective or how it has not been effective. And being able to articulate a coherent communication strategy about why it matters. So this is really important, I mean, just for very pragmatic and very sort of grounded reasons in continuation of funding. So usually grants and funding that may even come from your institution will have some qualifiers of how do we know this worked? How did it benefit those who participated in your offering? So once you sort of understand, okay, I need to have this coherent strategy, how do I go ahead and start to evaluate the offering? So what Grace and I have put together is both a sort of outcomes-based approach where we're going to be talking about measurement for sure, but it's also very much a process-based approach. So we're going to be incorporating both of those principles and how that evaluation sort of gets done. So sometimes process evaluation can be a formative approach where you're doing mid-program or mid-course assessments around what is working and how. So that can inform while you're actually engaging in your project or in your program that you can make adjustments. So if we wait until the end, which is outcomes or summative, it can be very hard to go back and change what wasn't working. So we usually try to have a blend on how that evaluation frame goes forward. How do I know if my offering worked? So this is where we're going to be centering more on an effective process and a really tight yet, and when I mean tight, I mean very rigorous, yet very flexible and very intentional towards those who will be impacted by your offering. So it's a high involvement approach. So how do I know if my offering worked? We're tying in these principles of process as well as being very selective in the measurement. What should I be measuring? So we're definitely not measuring everything that could be measured in your program. We're identifying, to the point of what Grace was saying a few moments ago, why is what I'm doing important, and how am I going to be approaching it? This is critical to answer, usually before you start, and that will be very impactful for the measurements that you select. So being pretty intentional around that. How do I maintain support for my offering? And I may be very biased, but I think evaluation and effective program evaluation, one that's intentional, one that offers high involvement for users, end users, and stakeholders, is critical to maintaining support for the offering because you're demonstrating impact. So I hope just from the summary slide, you're getting a sense that we're not just talking about accountability and accountability data. It's more about showing this intentional approach and how it truly impacts those who are engaging in your program. Piggybacking on that previous slide are just some common challenges that Grace and I came up with that we see a lot in engaging with our collaborative partners on evaluation. Just some of the things some of the challenges for people who aren't working directly in this area, they come up a lot. So this you can also view if, say, you were bringing in an evaluator or talking with an evaluator around, okay, so how would I approach my evaluation for my program? These are typically some of the challenges that we discuss. So Grace did a really wonderful job of outlining how people tend to focus on what they are doing and not the why and not the how. So it's a little bit of discovering, if you haven't already, which is what your theory of action is. How do you think, what are the mechanisms that are going to occur to get the outcome that you're looking for? which is related to number 2, which is very, very common. We skip the logic model, and those of you in academia are usually really familiar with like a conceptual model or a theoretical framework for your research. It's similar to that in the sense that there's usually some boxes and some arrows, and it's process-oriented, but it's all about your program. So it outlines the different aspects of what you're putting in workshops, curricula, what are the mechanisms of change, what do you think that your participants will be engaging in and changing in to get a certain set of selective outcomes. We typically really encourage people to do this before they start the work, because the logic model is a frame for your program going forward. So coming back to measurement, which is usually one of the first questions that people have questions about, is, well, what are the measures? How should I go about, you know, framing this? And going back into the research and seeing what has been done, even if it's not exactly what you have outlined in your program, can be a template or can be a frame with some adaptation based on something that may be validated or something that shows early promise. Next slide. So these, we separated 4 through 7 out, but they're all very interrelated. So I'll sort of talk about them going 4 through 7, but they'll all sort of bleed together. So in general, there can be a very common tendency to think too narrowly about an evaluation program, meaning we're just either very focused or hung up on what the single measurement should be or a single assessment should be, or thinking way too broadly and thinking that we need to measure every possible thing in the program. So what we are trying to start to articulate is that there's a balance. So we need good measurement, but we're selective about that measurement. And that's within the context of a process-based overall program evaluation that's just not focused on one single measure, but about engaging in a process that's both formative and summative. Coming back to this discussion number 5 around measurements, there can be also a tendency just to be focusing on pre and post time points. So what we mean by that is pre-intervention or pre-offering, and then measuring something that happens after. When there's usually, if we embody this more intentional approach that's focused on users and is process-oriented, we may be looking at things within the context of what's happening throughout your offering to inform evaluation outcomes. So it's broader than just pre and post, although sometimes it is pre and post, but I mean, what we're talking about is a more holistic approach right now. When we engage in an evaluation program that we're starting to describe now, we're trying to bring clarity to the process. So this includes the logic model. It includes this really upfront discussion with an evaluator, you know, selective about measurements. And it's our belief and our experience that when it's a very planned and very organized, and you know, you're working with someone who has an evaluation background, it's not overly complicated. You define your plan, you define your goals, you define your logic model, and then you go forward. And usually in number 7, you're bringing in that evaluator or that researcher early in the process, and that evaluation or researcher is part of your team. So the way that we approach evaluation here at the University of Wisconsin, where I work on a variety of evaluation projects in higher education, that is how we approach the evaluation, bringing in the evaluator and working with them one-on-one. So I hope that by describing some of the common challenges and some of the frames that we are starting to offer, we're starting to give you a sense of why program evaluation is a critical component, both to understanding what to do, how to improve it, how to develop it, but also how to obtain further funding and support for your program.
Okay. So now that we've addressed some of the basic theoretical frameworks and talked a little bit about the questions, we're going to move into the 3 steps for success model. And again, we really encourage you to engage with us during this webinar in your own intentional inquiry and really think about how these tools can be used in your current work right here, right now. So please take advantage of this opportunity to really think about how this applies to you while we're talking. So once again, the 3 steps really involve thinking about why what you're doing matters, what specifically it is that you're doing, and how your program, how your offering, how your curricula is related to change, and preferably sustainable change, all within an intentional framework. So we're going to begin with talking about the first step, which is why. And this part of this webinar, we're just going to review basically the model, and I think that the flow or the inquiry process, the intentional piece of this, becomes more apparent as you begin to engage these questions with your program in mind. But first of all, if you think about communicating to your students, to your department head, to your dean, to potential funders about your program, the number one thing that they want to know is what is the problem that you're trying to solve and why the problem matters. So you can have an absolutely brilliant program, but if you can't explain to people why there is a problem that matters, it's very, very difficult to enlist their support. Secondly, why are the skills that you are offering needed? So that directly relates to the problem at hand. If you don't have a problem at hand, it's very difficult to explain why the skills are needed. And it's also very important to intentionally consider why you are choosing particular skills that address the specific problem. And lastly, why is this important? Again, this is related to the problem statement in the beginning. So what does your offering fulfill, whether it be on an individual level, whether it be on a relational level, interpersonal, or in many cases a systemic level? What is it that your offering does to benefit or advance humanity? That's kind of the large overarching question. So of course, we tend to play down the what in this model just so that you can get a sense of the fact that the why and the how are equally as important. But of course, it's always necessary to think about what it is you're doing. And I think that that's where we see probably the greatest strength with our clients, is that our clients generally have a very clear idea of what it is that they're offering, what the tools are, and what capacities they're trying to build. So these are 3 very distinct what questions to ask yourself. So what specific skills are you teaching? Sometimes we have mindfulness programs and we talk about, there's a lot of literature, be it in the media or even the listservs that most of us are on, where people talk about instilling mindfulness, but that word now has become very diffuse. So I think it's really important, if you're using the term mindfulness or contemplative practice, to really think about what specific skills and capacities you're trying to impart, as opposed to just this overarching rubric of mindfulness. Because again, when you're speaking with people and trying to develop support for your program, they may not always understand the context or the content of what you're offering. So this leads to the second one. What specific tools are you using? Are you using breath work? Are you using journaling? Are you using nature experiences? Are you using meditation? So it's really, really important to be very, very specific about the tools you're using. And as Sara mentioned earlier, that helps to unpack what we will talk about a little bit further in terms of the mechanisms of action. And then lastly, what competencies are you building? That's a very different question than what capacities are you teaching and what tools you're using. So in the end, what competencies are you hoping to see? What types of change are you hoping to elicit in using the tools that you are using? So the why is important and the what is important, but the how is equally as important. So you may have different tools that you're using in your offering, but it's important to think about not only what tools you're using, the quality of those tools and how you define those tools, but how do those tools fit together into a logical approach where you can begin to see how one particular tool or skill naturally, generally flows to create change in another. And we'll talk about this a little bit further as we get into the case study. Next, and this relates to measurement quite a bit, is how do you define change? I think that in our work, sometimes we find that people have thought a lot about what they're doing, but they haven't really explicitly thought about how change will look. And this relates directly to measurement, which in our experience, we find that people get stuck around how to measure change because they're not explicitly clear on how they're defining change. And that's a really, really important distinction. Lastly, how you will assess change. So it's essential that you understand how you're defining change before you can think and create tools to assess change. So here's where we move from us speaking and presenting to inviting you to engage in your own inquiry around this model. So I'm going to give you a moment to get a pen and paper or whatever tools it is you'd like to use. And in the next section, I'm going to present to you a case study of a client that I worked with, and some of the details have been changed to protect their confidentiality. But this basically is a fairly simplistic model of how we use these 3 steps to work with them to unpack each one of these aspects of their program. They came to me with an established program and with established ideas, and as we just spoke with you about, they came with all of the what's basically outlined in great detail, but the why and the how were the 2 places where we needed to do the most work. And because their overarching goal was ultimately to create capacity and sustainability for their program and to obtain funding, it was very important for us to engage in this really intentional process of facilitating this discussion very mindfully as we went through this. So I encourage you to engage in this and really think about how these questions and how this example relates explicitly to what you are doing to create the maximum benefit for you as you listen to the remainder of this webinar. So the work was with an academic program that was looking to create leadership and clinical skills in their social work program. So it was part of an established social work program with all of the, so for those of you involved in social work, this is probably not terribly novel, but it included competencies around clinical skills, competencies around assessment, report writing, everything you could think about that might be related to working with people. But the most important focus of this program, because it is a social work emphasis, was really thinking about how to participate and engage leadership in the community and also how to instill clinical skills to their social work students. They wanted to incorporate mindfulness and meditation techniques into their program, and they had some really good tools that they were thinking about using, but the integration piece, because the why questions and the how questions hadn't been answered, we needed to flesh out. So they wanted to bring mindfulness and meditation techniques into the clinical skills course as part of the program. And ideally, they wanted to build enough capacity and enough support for bringing these practices in that this would become an embedded piece of the permanent program. Lastly, they wanted to evaluate and have tools for evaluating the effectiveness of this particular approach in order to receive additional funding from the university to study this and eventually obtain grant funding externally. So this is an example of a problem statement that this particular client had, and I'm sure that if you are contemplating a program or if you have a program or an offering in place, you probably, even if you haven't intentionally articulated it, there probably is a problem that you're trying to solve. So in the case of this particular client, they were saying that social workers and social work students tend to suffer from high levels of depression, stress, anxiety, and burnout because they're dealing with emotionally challenging situations on a daily basis, some of which can be potentially traumatic for the students and for the social workers. Over time, this can result in phenomena like depersonalization, lack of capacity to be present, which ultimately translates to poor clinical skills and reduced client impact. So if you look at the model at the bottom, you'll see that there is a fairly linear and very simplistic model of how we conceptualized that stress really was the primary agent that was in many ways leading to, in a linear fashion, depression, anxiety, and burnout. And the more stressed and the more emotionally dysregulated people became, social workers became, the more their clinical skills declined and the less impact they were experiencing with their clients. Now, this is actually a very circular problem, so I don't want to mislead you in looking at this model and thinking it's a very linear problem, because basically, as social work students and social workers experience client outcomes that are less than optimal, it increases their stress, it increases their emotional dysregulation, their depression, anxiety, burnout, and so it really is a circular model. But for many purposes, when we're thinking about intentionally evaluating programs right from the get-go, when we're trying to understand why it's important and how it relates to the problem, we begin by creating a very simplistic model with the understanding that generally, because we're dealing with human phenomenon for the most part, these really are more complex problems. But this helps us to create an overall heuristic just to get a sense of what we're doing and why it matters. So why were new skills needed? Obviously, the big problem in this particular school of social work and in their graduate population was that they felt as though their students needed to find different tools to effectively manage stress. So when you think about the offering you have, there probably is one or more ideas that immediately rise to the top as to why what you're doing is important. It could be, you know, I've talked with people that are teaching programs in the arts and in music, and sometimes stress creates a lot of performance anxiety and people are unable to rise to their best selves because they're so nervous. So a lot of times stress really is the culprit. So if you're finding you're saying, oh yeah, stress, it's a very common problem, but often it's that stress management technique that is really where these contemplative programs can be the most effective. So in this case, effectively managing stress was really at the root of the issue. The organizers and the developers of this program also felt as though the students needed some skills to become more self-compassionate so that they had tolerance of their own emotional experience around these difficult and challenging situations and could accept the fact that sometimes the clinical challenges were above and beyond their capacity, and that they were able to not only care for themselves but also have, or let's just say diffuse some of the perfectionistic tendencies that we all have, particularly when we were engaging in a new endeavor. So this was a main focus of this particular program. They also wanted the students to engage in the process of being compassionate externally so that they were extending compassion to their clients as opposed to being judgmental, being critical, because we know from the literature that compassion and acceptance are two of the key relational capacities that are necessary in order to facilitate trust in a clinical relationship and therapeutic change. So that was very important to them. And then also they wanted to instill mindfulness. And mindfulness, unfortunately, in this day and age now has myriad meanings, and the lack of clear definition, I think, can get us into trouble. And we'll talk a little bit about this when we're thinking about measurement. But their definition of mindfulness was paying attention to the present moment and also being very aware of their thoughts, feelings, sensations, and in the clinical context, being aware of their perceptions of the client, or what's called transference in clinical work, and how their relationship with the client was playing out in their own behavior, which is really important, and mindfulness can be an excellent tool for exploring that. Lastly, they were hoping, and that was their intention, that by teaching clinical skills, which is a key component to their program, and embedding these other contemplative practices in the program, it would increase their effectiveness. So as you can imagine, given the proliferation of offerings in contemplative programs and mindfulness these days, a lot of us face the question, why is what you're doing different than what everyone else is doing? And I think when you're dealing with issues of program sustainability, building capacity, building support in your department, gaining funding opportunities, it's absolutely essential to engage in this level of inquiry. It's absolutely essential to understand what it is that is unique, irrelevant, and relevant to your program. And sometimes I've engaged in this process with folks, and they discover that there really isn't anything unique to their program, and they either need to reevaluate the components of their program, perhaps add something, or in some cases, people decide to go with a more traditional program that's established because they can receive more support for going with something that has an evidence base. So it's really an important level of inquiry to think about what it is that's unique to your program and why that really matters. So in this case, few social work courses incorporate contemplative practices directly into their clinical skills training. So that was very unique to this program. And few social work programs emphasize contemplative skills as being really, really important in the training of social workers. So the contemplative practices do exist, but in this particular program, they were trying to find a very integrated, very seamless way so that the mindfulness programs and practices weren't feeling as though as they were external to the clinical skills, but they were actually embedded in the way people embodied the work. So it was a very different approach and really, really effective. So what are you teaching? And I think that for most of us who have developed programs, this is where we start. But sometimes we still are thinking more about the specific practices and less about what the specific tools are and what they're intended to do. And this is where we begin to flesh out intentionally the mechanisms of action. And this will hopefully become a little bit more apparent as we move through this example. So number one, this program wanted to give their students tools to relieve stress. Stress was undermining mood, it was undermining self-esteem, it was undermining effectiveness of students, and in some cases, students were leaving the program because they did not feel as though they had the competencies to be effective social workers. So they had tools to relieve stress was the first what they were teaching. Exercises to increase the awareness of stress, awareness of mood change and their effects on clinical skills and on basically quality of life for these students. Also practices to increase compassion for self and other, as well as, you can imagine, effective clinical skills were central to this program. So it's important to think about what you're teaching, but it's absolutely necessary to be explicit about the tools that you're using and your intended effects. And hopefully this will help to flesh this out a little bit. So they were specifically using breath exercises as their major mechanism for combating stress. They were explicitly using certain contemplative practices to inculcate mindfulness. Now again, mindfulness in their definition was developing an awareness of self, an awareness of the process between client and social worker, and also developing attention to thoughts, feelings, sensations that were very strong indicators of both the therapist's emotional experience, which was very important, as well as the client's emotional experience. They use compassion practices, in this case metta practices, in order to create self-compassion and other compassion. They use role play, and this is a fairly common tool to work with psychologists, social workers, others doing clinical work to begin to develop the skills to engage people in the work. So they use role play for clinical skills, and then they use clinical case studies to begin to try to incorporate all of these tools. So creating context in which there was high stress in a role play, where people needed to become very observant of their thoughts, feelings, and emotions, regulate their stress, use some of the meta practices or some of the ideas from the meta practices to help them develop a compassionate frame from which to deal with these challenges. So I'm just going to give you a moment here before I move on, just to take a second and think about how some of the tools that you use relate to, and I'll see if I can go back here. It's always a challenge in webinars with the technology. So think about, what are you teaching? Think about what specific tools you're using. And I'll just give you a second to jot that down. And then next, what skills are you building? So it may seem that these are very overlapping ideas, and they really are, but I think it's very important to develop a distinction between what you're teaching, what you're doing, and how the skills will be used. So in this case, the stress management tools were intended to help deal with challenging situations. The mood management techniques, which in this case were some of the mindfulness techniques, and the stress management techniques were designed to increase positive mood and decrease negative mood. The increase of mindfulness and compassion, in this particular case, were intended to increase compassion towards self and other. Also, all of these tools, stress management, mood management, were hoped, I mean, the intention was to decrease depersonalization. And by depersonalization, I mean creating an us, a self-other relationship in the clinical context where you begin to see someone not as similar to yourself, but as someone that you can't relate to, which generally creates a rift in clinical relationships and reduces clinical effectiveness. So once again, in the simple model on the bottom, you can see that stress is seen to be the major mechanism that leads to a depression, anxiety, burnout, contributes to poor clinical skills, and ultimately to reduced clinical impact. So now we move into the how. And really, we've been doing this repeatedly. It's just that we begin with the why, we go to the what, and then we move into the how. So it's almost as though we're going through this iterative process of examining our model through different lenses. And that's essentially what this intentional evaluation process, as we're setting it up for this particular function, is doing. So basically, how the pieces fit together. First of all, these clients imagined, and this was their intention, that breathing and contemplative practices, ultimately the major mechanism that they were trying to affect was student stress. And they were hoping that reduced stress would lead to improved mood, decreased depression, anxiety, and burnout, and increases in mindfulness and compassion. So that's how those pieces fit together. The next piece was that it was hoped that improved mood, reduced stress, lower depression, anxiety, burnout, and increased mindfulness would improve clinical skills and clinical effectiveness, which is the third, I guess it's an arrow from the left. And lastly, all of these things would increase client impact. And again, this implies that it's a linear model, but as clinical efficacy increases, stress can often be reduced, mood can increase. So these models are actually very circular and iterative. But in this particular case, in this part of the process, we were dealing with a very simplistic story because that's what we can communicate to others in the most effective way. So last is how to assess change. Assessing change often seems to be one of those places where Sara and I encounter interesting dynamics with our clients for various reasons. And I think that back to the initial idea of working in an intentional capacity, doing intentional evaluation, it is of the utmost importance when we're considering how to evaluate a program to consider it with the user in mind. So I think that as researchers, many of us are of the orientation that the most important thing that we can derive from evaluating program are data points that show change. And yes, that is actually very true, that it always helps if we can show that something that we're doing benefits people. But the summative evaluation, the showing of effects over time, is not always the most informative piece of the information. So it's really, really important to consider not only assessing offerings from the perspective of finding out what works for the particular person, so in this case the social work student, but also deriving opinions from other people to get secondary ideas as to how your program is not only affecting the individual, but also the system. And that probably sounds very confusing, so I'll try to unpack it a little bit. So in this case, self-reported change, each student was given or asked to complete at multiple time points, surveys of their stress, depression, anxiety, mindfulness, self-compassion, and compassion. In this particular case, our initial intention, or at least the initial intention of this program, was to look at pre-post change. And yet we often find, particularly in behavior change research, that change occurs along a trajectory. And what happens sometimes when we're bringing together contemplative practices is we actually see a curve where it looks as though people are getting worse over time on measures of mindfulness and compassion. And that's actually, in some ways, a measure of success because it shows that people are becoming more mindful, and when they complete a questionnaire at a second or a third time point, they are explicitly more understanding of what it is that they're bringing to a process, and they rate themselves lower. So it's a really interesting thought. But we don't have time to get into that in greater detail. So the other piece was other reported change, and in this case we asked clinical supervisors to rate students' clinical skill, and we also decided to take ratings of patient satisfaction and look at patient self-reported symptoms over time. So we not only had qualitative data giving us a sense of student performance and patient satisfaction with the clinical outcomes, but also quantitative measures of reported symptoms over time. So we used a mixed methods approach to get a richer picture, both in a formative way as the program was proceeding, but also in a summative way so we could look at pre-post time change. So as you can imagine, to try to sum this complex process up in 45 minutes is easier said than done. Hopefully you have the time while I've been speaking to think about how this particular model, how thinking about the why and the what and the how can be used in your own particular offering to better understand what it is that you're doing and how you are delivering your offering. Now, I know that there are people who are watching this that are in various stages of program development. Some of you have established programs, some of you are considering programs, and I think that, as Sara said early on, what we have discovered is that the most successful programs from start to finish are those that begin with the end in mind. So it's not just about how to create a program, but it's also about thinking about how you will evaluate the program, how you will create sustainability for your program, how you will speak to your program to obtain support, obtain funding, and even in some respects engage students so that they realize that there's some value to doing something different than the traditional model. So Sara and I are going to wrap up this last little bit here. Sorry, I'm having some bouncing around with the webinar screen. So what we suggest as next steps once you've gone through this process of going through the 3 steps for yourself and thinking about these questions is we suggest, and this is not for our own interest, we suggest that you always have an evaluation professional collaborating with you at some level so that you can have someone with the skills and tools and expertise in evaluation to help you answer some of these questions. And it could be a professional evaluator, it could be someone to just have a conversation around what you are doing with, but it's really important to have that support early on. What you saw, the green arrows at the bottom, were the makings of what a logic model could look like. They tend to be a little bit more complex as you unpack the mechanisms of action and the outcomes, but that's kind of a preliminary idea of what a logic model might look like. It's also important to thoroughly examine assessments and tools that will most accurately and comprehensively evaluate what's important to you. And then, of course, when you get into evaluation research and research in general, there are issues around research design, your data analysis plan, dissemination, and for many of you, the most important piece is creating strategic plans for funding so that you can implement your offering more reliably and sustainability over time. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Sara.
I think you really covered it well, actually. So, yeah.
Thank you. So, Jen, I don't know if you want to jump to questions or if you want me to. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
So
Well,
yeah, thank you so
first, before
much.
we do that, I just want to thank you for listening and thank you for engaging. And I'm going to leave this slide up, so just on the off chance, I know folks are super busy. If on the off chance you don't have time to stick around for Q&A, you can feel free to look us up at our website. There's the address on the bottom, or feel free to drop us an email with any questions that we're not going to be, unfortunately, answering in the short period of time that we have left. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Grace and Sarah, for sharing this set of guidelines and tools with us. It's so helpful. And at this point, we'd like to invite everyone to type in any questions that you have for Grace and Sarah into the questions part of your toolbar there. And so we're just going to have about a minute of silence as people type in their questions, so you can have just a moment to think. All right, so we have a question from Barbara. It seems that there is a chicken and egg problem here. In order to get funding to pay for evaluation, one has to make the case that the proposed program is effective, but we can't make that case without doing the evaluation. How do you get around this problem?
Sarah, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, that's common. So some of the things that you can do are to look, we sort of covered this earlier on in the challenges portion. You can look to other programs, other areas of research to demonstrate that those findings of impact can be transferable to your setting, and how. And a lot of times we've seen that if you come to the table with an effective evaluation plan to demonstrate how you are going to assess the impact, that can give you more leverage at the bargaining table for funding, to demonstrate, well, this is what we've seen in other areas, this is what we've seen in other areas that have been effective, and this is how we're going to effectively assess the impact and perhaps scalability of this program. So a lot of times if I'm working on an evaluation project, say here on campus at UW, those are the sorts of things they're asking us about university-based programs in general. And it can be, you can start to at least give some sense of very basic measures of impact. Say, if we target a faculty-based program to enhance their teaching and teaching pedagogy, we can say that 1,500 students will benefit or be impacted by this one change in teacher. Now, that's not assessing was that program affected, but you can start to maybe give some estimates around, well, who will be involved, how will they be touched. This is how we've seen other programs, when they are then measuring effectiveness, what we might look for in our change. So you can look to other programs or courses or offerings on your campus that are similar to make that argument of transferability. And then you can maybe, before you get the funding, talk about scale. Sometimes that helps, and I think Grace would probably agree that if you come to the table with an evaluation plan, that is a nice piece of leverage in most cases.
Absolutely, Sarah, and I think that one of the pieces of work that I did with this client in the case study, one of their objectives as part of our scope of service was to help them to develop a strategic plan for funding. And so part of the process that we went through was going through this three-step model. The other piece, and I think that particularly if you're looking at contemplative programs, there's a very, very strong research base now to support the fact that these types of programs reduce stress. And I think that for almost universally, regardless of what type of discipline that you are teaching, you can probably make a compelling case to use some contemplative practices for stress reduction to increase performance, regardless of the discipline. So I think in some ways, that's the strongest evidence base that you can use in support, and I would encourage you to consult the literature, look at where you can find a strong support for stress, and try to weave a story about stress reduction into your model and into your justification for contemplative practice, because I do believe at this point in time, given the literature, the strongest argument for these programs really is there.
Thank you. We have another question here from Aaron, who is wondering about situations where expectations of how a program might affect those involved are not well understood. And is it possible that an assessment might miss the mark, failing to measure some aspect that is important to the change process?
Absolutely. You know, one of the difficult things in working with humans is that we are incredibly complex, and when you're looking at any type of pedagogy, any type of teaching and learning process, one of the universal frustrations, and I can speak to this as a psychologist, is that there is just no way humanly possible that I can capture the rich experience of an individual and their social ecology. It's an eternal frustration, and I think that that's one of the pieces that for me, I think is important in my practice, is to understand the limitations and also prioritize what it is that we are measuring and where we believe that the assessment will have the greatest impact, not only in creating a case for our programs, but also in creating an impact for those who are serving. So assessment isn't just about creating data points in a story to create capacity and sustainability. But Sara and I both strongly believe that assessment and evaluation should, at the very heart, be in the service of the people that we're serving, in this case, our students. So it should not be this amorphous process, but it should be very transparent, and the assessment should be beneficial to the people who are participating. If you want to add to that, Sara.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the beneficial roles of having both summative and formative aspects to your evaluation, so that if you're doing a formative evaluation means you're engaging in a reflective process on what you're doing as you move through the program, you can make those changes. So have I worked on evaluation projects that have missed the mark? Absolutely, and that's not wrong. So we're trying to articulate an approach that is flexible, that is learning about yourself, your program, the end users, those who you are impacting, so that over time you can improve both your evaluation plan but also your program. So if we didn't really speak to, at a large extent, the time element to program evaluation, but it's sort of our view that it is ongoing throughout your projects and perhaps career. So as you engage in evaluation and you learn how to do it well, both working with an evaluator and doing it yourself perhaps, there's a sort of a self-improvement process that occurs. So no, it's not perfect, but we still engage in the process of improvement around evaluation.
Absolutely. Sara alluded to this earlier in our webinar, but I think that some of us, or many of us, are often trained to think that not obtaining the findings that we're hoping for, or finding negative effects or finding null effects, are a sign of failure. And I can tell you, over years of working in intervention studies and evaluation, that often the things that I didn't expect to find, or the effects that were in the opposite direction of what I was hoping for, are by far the most important data that I will collect. So I encourage you to, look at whatever you're assessing and evaluating, and try to do it with a beginner's mind, and really look to see what you are changing, because there's just pearls of wisdom in your evaluation, often not where you expect to find them.
Great. Wonderful. I think that's all the time we have for questions, but if you have more in-depth questions, Sara and Grace have included the email address for their organization on this last slide here, so you're welcome to email them. And I just want to thank you both again for conducting this webinar with us. It's been really informative, and I hope that you get a lot of wonderful questions from our community.
Thank you for the honor, Jen. We're really grateful.
Yeah,
thank you. And just to remind everyone, the webinar has been recorded and it will be available on our website soon if you'd like to share it with colleagues. And if you'd like to view past webinars or learn more about the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education and the Center for Contemplative Mind in Society, please visit our website at contemplativemind.org. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen.